Okay, so I think we're going to get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this final event in our first ever summer speaker series at the Hall Center for the Humanities here at KU. This event is co-sponsored by Kansas Public Radio and the Commons at KU, to whom many thanks. My name is Richard Godbeer, and I have the great honor to be the director of the Hall Center, where we believe that the humanities must play a crucial role in building a humane future for our world. Whether this is the first event that you've attended at the Hall Center or the latest of many, I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope that you'll return over and over again. This is a place of welcome and good cheer for all who care about the humanities. Because of the physical distancing made necessary by the ongoing pandemic, the entire summer speaker series has taken place online. Our 2020 to 21 speaker series will begin online and then shift to in-person gatherings once it's safe to do so. All events this coming year will be streamed for those who are unable to attend in person. Tonight, we not only end our summer series, but launch a year-long speaker series entitled Migration Stories, featuring a range of humanities scholars and writers who examine the stories of people from various historical periods and locations around the globe whose lives have included migration. This series reminds us yet again how significant and relevant the arts and humanities are to our contemporary world. Our guests this fall will include Juan Felipe Herrera, 21st Poet Laureate of the United States, who will be reading from his work on September the 16th. That's going to be an amazing event, so please make sure you're there. If you'd like to learn more about our public programming for the coming year at the Hall Center, please visit our website at hallcenter.ku.edu. As all areas of the university adapt to this unprecedented situation we find ourselves in and face cuts in funding, we need your help more than ever. We hope that you'll become a friend of the Hall Center or renew your membership, if possible, with an increased gift. Membership as a friend gives you access to special events and an amazing community of inquisitive, interesting people. Your generosity will help us to support outstanding scholarship and to share the relevance and excitement of humanities in our contemporary world. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, poet, educator, and performer José Olivarez, who will be reading from his first book-length poetry collection, Citizen Illegal, winner of the 2018 Chicago Review of Books Poetry Prize, a finalist for the prestigious Penn Gene Stein Book Award, and named a top book of 2018 by the New York Public Library. José Olivarez is the son of Mexican immigrants. His poetry explores the stories, contradictions, joys, and sorrows that embody life in the spaces between Mexico and America. With empathy, incisive humor, and emotional power, Olivarez takes on complex issues of race, ethnicity, gender, class, and immigration, using an accessible language that reaches out to engage readers and listeners. In 2018, he was awarded the first annual Author and Artist in Justice Award from the Phillips Brooks House Association. He's co-editor of the forthcoming anthology, The Breakbeat Poets, Volume 4, Latinxed, and he is co-host of the podcast series, The Poetry Gods. He's the recipient of fellowships from Canto Mundo, Poets House, the Bronx Council on the Arts, the Poetry Foundation, and the Conversation Literary Festival. He's also a master teaching artist. In 2017 to 18, he was a lead teaching artist for the Teen Lab program at the Art Institute in Chicago. He has led writing workshops and diversity trainings for a wide range of institutions, including the Lincoln Center, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Studio Museum of Harlem, and Inside Out Literary Arts. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Paris Review, and Chicago Magazine. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat function. Please, if you'd like to ask questions, enter them there, and then when we reach the Q&A section of tonight's event, then I'll read out as many of them as we can get through. But for the moment, please join me in welcoming our guest, José Olivarez.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Kansas University. Thank you to the Hall Center. Richard, before I get started, a quick question. Is it okay to swear tonight?
It is from my point of view.
All right, there we go. All right, so I'm going to start by reading a poem called Mexican-American Disambiguation. Like Richard said, this is from my first book of poems, Citizen Illegal, which I have here. This is a poem I wrote after the poet Idris Goodwin. My parents are Mexican, who are not to be confused with Mexican Americans or Chicanos. I am a Chicano from Chicago, which means I'm a Mexican American with a fancy college degree and a few tattoos. My parents are Mexican, who are not to be confused with Mexicans still living in Mexico. Those Mexicans call themselves Mexicanos. White folks at parties call them pobrecitos. American colleges call them international students and diverse. My mom was white in Mexico and my dad was mestizo. And after they crossed the border, they became diverse and minorities and ethnic and exotic. But my parents call themselves Mexicanos, who again should not be confused for Mexicanos living in Mexico. Those Mexicanos might call my family gringos, which is the word my family calls white folks. And white folks call my parents interracial. Colleges say, put them on a brochure. My parents say, ¿Qué significa esa palabra? I point out that all the men in my family marry lighter-skinned women. That's the Chicano in me, which means it's the fancy college degrees in me, which is also diverse of me. Everything in me is diverse, even when I eat American foods like hamburgers, which, to clarify, are American when a white person eats them and diverse when my family eats them. So much of America can be understood like this. My parents were undocumented when they came to this country. And by undocumented, I mean sin papeles. And by sin papeles, I mean royally fucked, which should not be confused with the American dream, though the two are cousins. Colleges are not looking for undocumented diversity. My dad became a citizen, which should not be confused with keys to the house. We were safe from deportation, which should not be confused with walking the plank, though they're cousins. I call that sociology, but that's just the Chicano in me who should not be confused with the diversity in me, or the Mexicano in me who is constantly fighting with the upwardly mobile in me, who is good friends with the Mexican American in me, who the colleges love, but only on brochures, who the government calls non-white Hispanic or white Hispanic, who my parents call mijo, even when I don't come home so much. Cool. I think it's a little bit more nerve-wracking to do these readings over Zoom for a number of reasons. But one of them is that I think, excuse me, I'm in Harlem right now. So if you hear sounds coming from outside, that's, you know, New York City talking. I think it's hard to read poems sitting down. I find myself wanting to stand. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that first poem. I'm really excited to, I don't know if excited is the right word, but I'm eager to hear what you have to say about migration, and I'm eager to talk to you about migration, you know, which is something that when I think about all of the things that led to me becoming a poet, I think, you know, being the son of immigrants is like the very first thing that comes to mind. Like my parents' journey has had such a huge impact on my own journey. I'm gonna read this next poem. This next poem is called I Love the World, So I Married It. I wrote it thinking about like when we were kids, people used to say, if you love it so much, why don't you marry it? So this is where that poem comes from. I love the world, so I married it. Music, even on the day my grandma died, there were mangoes, though I tasted nothing. But slowly I came back to the world and carne asada, better than I remembered. Smoke off the meat. I couldn't contain my happiness, even though it felt offensive. to smile with my grandma buried and getting eaten by the flowers. And sometimes I look at my love and think I would like to stay, to put a welcome mat on our doorstep with our names hyphenated. When I was young, I believed in forever. Then my uncle died, and I knew forever included none of my family, included no friends. Their stories rotting in my head until I lose them again. So I know I will divorce the world and let it keep my most treasured possessions. A 6-piece with lemon pepper and mild sauce on, all the honey of a slow kiss, my Apple Music playlist, the way mi abuelita smiled and called me Lupito. I hated that name, except when she said it. Cool. This next poem is a poem called No Vaporu. I wrote it because, so I grew up reading a ton of books, and in all the books that I read, none of them ever mentioned Vaporu. And growing up, Vaporu was, one of our biggest medicines. It was like one of the go-to medicines. So I was like, if I ever get a chance to write a book, Vaporu's gotta be in there. So this is my poem for Vaporu. And if you don't know what Vaporu is, you can type it into Google, or if you like, I'll tell you afterwards. No, Vaporu. Vaporu is pronounced Vaporu, like loud or chew. The label for Vaporu says it's for cough suppression, but in my house, Vaporu is for headaches, sore muscles, nightmares, and everything else. Put some Vaporu on my dad's diabetic toes and watch the sugar evaporate. Miss a day of church? Put some Vaporu on your forehead and watch forgiveness flush your cheeks. Put some Vaporu on our bank account and watch the bill collector stop calling. When I forget a word in Spanish, I take a teaspoon of Vaporu under the tongue. So that's that poem. It's one of my favorite poems in the book. In part because once I was at a high school and I read poems, and I read that poem, and one of the young men came up to me afterwards and was like, yo, I really love that Vaporu poem. I feel like I should give you something. And then he gave me a bag of hot Cheetos for free. So, I don't know if you've heard, poetry is not often the highest paying profession, but I'll take a bag of hot Cheetos for sure. This next poem is a poem I wrote for my dad. I write a lot of poems for my dad, so this is one for him. It's called Getting Ready to Say I Love You to My Dad, It Rains. I love you, Dad, I say to the cat. I love you, Dad, I say to the sky. I love you, Dad, I say to the mirror. It rains and my mom's plants open their mouths. My dad stays on the couch. Maybe the couch opened its mouth and started eating my dad. I love you, Dad, I say to the couch, its tongue working my dad like a puppet. I hear the rain fall and think the city is drinking or making itself clean. I am here with my dad and the TV drones on and on, so I'm not sure I hear it. My dad grunting and nodding, not the mushy stuff I was expecting. Neither of us cry, no hug or a kiss, just a grunt and a nod. I love you, Dad, I say to my dad. We sit together and watch TV. Outside it rains. My dad turns the volume up. The city is drunk. The city is singing badly in the shower. I killed the plant once because I gave it too much water. Lord, I worry that love is violence. My dad is silent and our relationship is not new or clean. I killed the plant once because I didn't give it enough water. My dad and I watch TV on a rainy day. We rinse our mouths with this water. Cool. So I'm gonna put this book down for a second. I'm gonna read you some other things. The next poem that I'm gonna read you is also a poem that I wrote for my dad. This one is an older poem. It's called Bulls versus Suns 1993. And yeah, it's a poem for my dad. If you weren't around in 1993, then the title comes from the NBA Finals that year was the Chicago Bulls versus the Phoenix Suns. That was the NBA Finals. And it's one of my earliest memories. So I wrote a poem about it. This is for my dad. Bulls versus Suns, 1993. Sitting on your lap, watching your eyes follow the bouncing basketball. And my heart is 100 basketballs, dribbling mad love for your arms, hugging me, throwing me into the air and catching me again after Marv Albert exclaims, "Here's Paxson for 3. Yes, and love is your fist closed and not fighting for once. Your fist fireworks above your head, the way you say Paxson with the mouth full of joy. And my heart is shooting 1,000 jump shots, heart running layup drills, looking for you in the bleachers, heart loving what you love. Damn, my heart running suicides to be in your heart's Hall of Fame." Cool. This next poem I'll read is also a basketball poem. In like 2013, I had this idea. I was like, I'm gonna write a book of basketball poems that are, you know, they're like other poems, but disguised as basketball poems. And my idea was, you know, maybe I could talk about gender and some other issues, but if I disguised it in basketball, then maybe I could get some more young men, especially to read them. And you know, obviously also I really love basketball. So this next poem is called Lob City. It's after a poet named Martín Espada, who has a poem called The Republic of Poetry. And Lob City, I kind of feel like I'm just showing my age all over. Lob City doesn't exist anymore. It was the nickname for the LA Clippers team that featured Chris Paul and Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan. And they were around a few years ago, but now they're all on different teams. So this is called Lob City. In Lob City, there are no streets, only alleys, and every alley has a basketball rim, and every rim has a Kia sports car parked underneath. And you don't walk around anything in Lob City. You jump over the Kia, catch a lob, throw down, and hang on the rim for just a second. In Lob City, boys blow kisses at girls like smooth passes. The girls catch those kisses and dunk them in their backpacks. Some girls dunk them in the trash can. Ain't nobody got time for kisses in Lob City. In Lob City, game recognized game, so even the clouds look like they're running a game of 5-on-5. The rain tastes like sweat. The trees line the courts and cheer after a big play. The branches covered in bushes look like pom-poms dancing in the wind. In Lob City, workers show up to the office wearing shorts and jerseys, dribbling brown bag lunches and basketballs. Surgeons celebrate success by chest bumping the nurse, get a surprise Gatorade shower at lunch. Office workers ask their bosses for a raise and earn it by winning a game of one-on-one in Lob City. In Lob City, lovers go hard in the paint, scrapping for rebounds. When the games are over, they hold hands in the park and whisper sweet nothings that sound like trash talk. In Lob City, the police officer stopping you will tell you that you traveled and will not let you go until you beat them in the game of horse. Cool. So those were some older poems. Now I'm gonna read some newer things. And as a reminder, if you're joining us late, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions if you have them. We're gonna save some time at the end for questions. But yeah, I'm gonna read you some new things. Maybe I'll start by reading you the newest thing that I'm working on. This is a short story tentatively titled Wintertime Be Real. And I'm just gonna read the first section of it. So it's not exactly poetry, I hope you'll forgive me, but this is what I have so far. I haven't had it, this is the first time I'm reading this to anyone, so thank you for listening. So far this is called Wintertime Be Real. It's a tentative title. It all started on a fall day at TF North High School in Calumet City, Illinois. Mrs. Jacobs asked her history class to turn to page 44, and there, among the left margin, was a picture of the country now called Mexico. Below that was a drawing of an Aztec Indian. All of the Mexican kids sighed audibly. This was their moment. Oscar Emiliano Lopez saw the drawing of the Aztec Indian and exclaimed, "Oh snap, it's me." No, it's not. James Michael Jones was the smartest kid at TF North. He was also Oscar Emiliano's best friend. They'd been best friends since approximately first grade, when they bonded over their shared preference for forest green crayons and the fact they both preferred to use their whole names when introducing themselves. Oscar Emiliano did not go by Oscar or Big O or Nano or Millie Rock. James Michael was not Jimmy or Jay or Mike or J Mike or Miggy. Because Oscar Emiliano and James Michael were tighter than 2 and 3, James Michael was able to tell Oscar Emiliano some truths he might not otherwise hear. That don't look like you, bro. You look more like Cortez on the next page. It was true. Oscar Emiliano was not white, but you would be forgiven if you thought otherwise. Like class smartass Yesenia Rosas put it, that boy's been stopped by the police too many times to be white. If Oscar Emiliano was white, then God forgot to tell the white people of Calumet City. Oscar Emiliano was not white, but he was not black, and he was not brown like his dad. Here's Yesenia Rosas again. Oscar, which Oscar? Oscar Emiliano or Oscar Lamar? Oscar Emiliano looks like Be Real in the wintertime. Or like James Michael pointed out just now, he looked a little like the genocidal maniac Hernan Cortez. Ouch. That's not exactly what a young, woke, and proud Chicano wants to hear. James Michael looked at the page in front of him with the same skeptical look he gave all history books. His parents were professors of history at South Suburban College. He read the autobiography of Malcolm X the same summer he finished reading all of the Percy Jackson books. He read Asada the summer he started trading Pokemon cards. The young man knew his stuff, and in all of his time reading about the various histories of various peoples throughout the world, he had learned to be skeptical of his non-Black classmates. Even so-called people of color might turn their back on Black people if it was convenient to them. His friend Oscar Emiliano might be descended from the Aztecs and the Spanish, and maybe even from Black people brought to Mexico to be enslaved, but James Michael was always skeptical of his friends' understandings of struggle. His friends might be smart and caring, but they could always opt out of certain struggles. James Michael couldn't, or as Yesenia Rosas would say, James Michael, that dude could make broccoli out of cupcakes. That dude could make basura out of mild sauce. He's cool though. So maybe I'll start there. I'll stop there. That's the first page of this short story that I'm working on, which ultimately I dream is a story of migration in reverse. So what I'm planning on having happen is having Oscar Emiliano and James Michael take a trip to Mexico. And Oscar Emiliano's gonna expect to find some sense of self, and instead, chaos will ensue. I'll say that, chaos will ensue. I'm gonna read some more poems, but let me know what you think, because like I said, I've never read that out loud to anybody, so thank you for listening. All right, this poem is called Nation of Domination. It's from a collaboration with a visual artist named Victoria Martinez out of Chicago. And what you need to know before I read this poem is Nation of Domination is an old school wrestling group, and The Rock used to be a part of the Nation of Domination. And he kind of betrayed the leader, who's named Farouk. And that's kind of how The Rock became a wrestling star. So this is Nation of Domination. It's a poem for my mom. Nation of Domination. My mom hugs me and wants me to stay. I have my foot on the pedal. a fake gold chain on my neck. I confess I'm a sucker. I never want magicians to reveal their secrets. I want to live in the unknowing where everything is possible. My mom dances with me to Los Bukis. She thinks this makes me her baby still. Perspective is a magic trick. I hit my brother with the rock bottom, and I bet you can guess what I leave out. Ask Farouk if you need a hint. The brain is full of magic I don't understand. No one signs up to take a dive. In wrestling, there's a team of riders who decide who wins and who loses. The metaphor is obvious. My mom wasn't born to play the role of mom. I don't care how many baby dolls she played with. I dance with my mom to Los Bukis, and you're a fool if you believe it's her son she's trying to hold on to. This is another poem from that series of collaborations with Victoria Martinez out of Chicago. This poem is called Moonshine. What I'll say about the series of collaborations is, so Victoria is she works in collage a lot of the time. And a lot of the collages are like tinged with elements of nostalgia for particular parts of her childhood. And though we were both born in Chicago, we grew up in different parts of the city. And so I wanted to try and use the technique of collage, right? So like in that last poem, you got the collage of both wrestling, which is very nostalgic to me, but then also like the collage of like my mom and my brother and whatever else I could kind of fit in there. So I was thinking about like, how could I make collages while writing? And that's what I'll say about this series of poems. So this poem is called Moonshine. The poets are right about the moonlight. I take my spot of sky and deposit it into a savings account. Only after the bank confiscated our house did I understand roses don't grow without pricked hands. I didn't have to spend a summer in a freezer packing lunch meat to know the value of sunlight. My mom didn't have to spend a decade wiping down floors to appreciate education. When I give you a bouquet of roses, I give you a bouquet of bloody hands, a handful of dirt and the worms that doted on your roses. When I take my piece of sky out of the bank, it's smaller. The drunks are right about the moonshine. Cool. Actually, I'll read this next poem too. So this is another poem in that series of collaborations. This poem is a love poem. It's called Shelter Island. I think that's all you need to know. Shelter Island is out in Long Island. Shelter Island. Frigid are the branches of black trees cutting through a blacker night. Missing are the lampposts that adorn every few feet of New York. Cold is your hand in my hand, and yes, I am a man, and you are a woman. My wilderness is not unlike the woods that surrounds us. The sky in my wild, lit by lanterns in the faces of animals. My own flammable face, my father's temperament, my thrifted excuse. Yes, it's the night before 45 is sworn in as president. And yes, we leave the city and we would leave the planet too. You hold my hand and we walk into the teeth of the hour, armed with each other. Bitter cold is the world we leave behind. When we hold hands, we invent a spaceship. Cool. All right, so this next poem is in Ars Poetica. And then I'll read some more poems from the book. And then after that, I think I'll read, I think I'll just end by reading poems from the book. So this next poem is called Ars Poetica. Ars Poetica. Migration is derived from the word migrate, which is a verb defined by Merriam-Webster as to move from one country, place, or locality to another. Plot twist. Migration never ends. My parents moved from Jalisco, Mexico to Chicago in 1987. They were dislocated from Mexico by capitalism, and they arrived in Chicago just in time to be dislocated by capitalism. Question: is migration possible if there is no other land to arrive in? My work is to imagine. My family started migrating in 1987 and they never stopped. I was born mid-migration. I've made my home in that motion. Let me try again. I tried to become American, but America is toxic. I tried to become Mexican, but Mexico is toxic. My work is to do more than reproduce the toxic stories I inherited and learned. In other words, just because it is art doesn't mean it is inherently nonviolent. My work is to write poems that make my people feel safe, seen, or otherwise loved. My work is to make my enemies feel afraid, angry, or otherwise ignored. My people are my people. My enemies, capitalism. Susan Sontag says, victims are interested in the representation of their own sufferings. Remix. Survivors are interested in the representation of their own survival. My work, survival. Question: why poems? Answer. All right. So this next poem that I'll read you is called Ode to Cheese Fries. I wrote it because I love cheese fries. And also because I was homesick for Chicago. I was living on the East Coast when I wrote this poem. So this is called Ode to Cheese Fries. What do you need to know? There's a restaurant called Panos that I shout out in this poem. Panos is like a little greasy spoon in Calumet City, Illinois, which is where I grew up. Ode to Cheese Fries. Golden goo of artificial delicious, what probably lines my stomach with sunlight grease for weeks after eating the yellow, so yellow, it could only be manufactured. So what if it's fake? As much cheese content as Apple Jolly Ranchers. I come from a city of foreclosure, empty lot, city where we got dollar store brand action figures. So what, my Wolverine didn't have retractable claws or the right uniform. So my joy at Panos, my favorite fried everything spot, the cashier's voice, a box of Newports filtered through throat. I didn't know I would miss this home where the patties come from freezers and maybe not ever from cows or even animals. I live in a city that brags about its organic, fair trade, quinoa-fed beef. Of course, I miss the 90s pop playing in the restaurant, the Backstreet Boys live in Cal City, where the band never breaks up. The song plays on repeat as the cashier takes my order. Say it with me, cheese fries, please. Give me everything artificial, including cardboard fries, the bread fresh out of some Walmart cloning experiment. Throw in a cold pop. I want a joy so fake, it stains my insides and never fades away. So that's one of my poems for Chicago. Let's see, what should I read next? I know what I want to read. I want to read this poem, if I can find it. This poem is called My Family Never Finished Migrating, We Just Stopped. So when I was writing my book, I was aware that because my name is José Olivarez and because, you know, my parents are from Mexico, that no matter what I wrote, it would be read as an immigration story, as a migration story. And I wanted to make sure that I was doing more than just seconding the stories that people already tell about migrants, if that makes sense, right? I didn't want to write a book of poems that just further cemented people's ideas of what migration looked like or felt like or could be. I wanted to try to subvert those narratives. So this poem I wrote, it's called My Family Never Finished Migrating, We Just Stopped. This poem was also inspired by the movie Logan, that Wolverine movie from not too long ago. My family never finished migrating, we just stopped. We invented cactus. To survive the winters, we created steel. At my dad's mill, I saw a man dressed like a Martian walk straight into the fire. The flames licked his skin, but like a pet, it never bit him. In the desert, they find our baseball caps, our empty water bottles, but never our bodies. Even the best ICE agents can't track us through the storms. But I have a theory. Some of our cousins don't care about LA or Chicago. They build a sanctuary underneath the sand, under the skin we shed, so we can wear the desert like a cobija, under the bones of our loved ones, bones worn thin as thorns to terrorize blue agents, bones worn thin as guitar strings, so when the wind blows, we can follow the music home. Richard, I saw you pop up momentarily. Are we running low on time?
No, I was just making sure that my screen was working.
All right, excellent.
You're fine.
Just double checking. Okay, so I wrote that poem. I'll read you another little change of pace. So this poem is called You Get Fat When You're in Love. It's a true story. I wrote this poem because my friends were arguing. And so one of my friends was like, you can always tell when so-and-so is in love because they start to get a little chubbier. And you can always tell when they're single again because they get skinny. They get right back to being skinny. So this poem is called You Get Fat When You're in Love. And it's a true story. You get fat when you're in love. You got a little extra love on your ankles, love hanging over your belt line. Love makes it hard to fit inside your pants sometimes. Love got you buying bigger sizes, need deeper pockets for all this love. Your buttons can't hold all the love rippling up the middle of your rib cage. Love turns those shirts into accordions. You make music with this love. Carry yourself like a song. When you get skinny, everyone rushes to compliment you. They want to know what your secret is. Tell me, they say, what's your secret? You look great. Call it the broke heart diet. Love left you, then you left you. Now all you have is this slowly disappearing body. Cool. All right. So I think I'll read maybe 2 more poems and then we can have a conversation. I see we already have 4 questions, so that's cool. Thank you all again for listening. Yeah, I don't know what else to read. Let's see. All right, so I'll read 2 more poems. This poem is called I Asked Jesus How I Got So White. I asked Jesus how I got so white. Depending on the population of the room in question, I get asked what I am. My mom told me I'm Mexican, but because Mexican women can't be trusted, some people want to know if I'm really Mexican. Because I know I'm a questionable narrator when it comes to my own life. I asked Jesus how I got so white, and Jesus says, man, I've been trying to figure out the same damn thing myself. So that's that poem. It's a short poem. All right. Hey, we got 2 more questions. That's what's up. Thank you, everybody, for sending in their questions. This will be my last poem. This poem is called Mexican Heaven. Mexican Heaven. 1, all of the Mexicans sneak into heaven. St. Peter has their name on the list, but none of the Mexicans have trusted a list since Ronald Reagan was president. 2, St. Peter is a Mexican named Pedro, but he's not a saint. Pedro waits at the gate with a shot of tequila to welcome all the Mexicans to heaven, but he gets drunk and forgets about the list. All the Mexicans walk into heaven even our no good cousins who only go to church for baptisms and funerals. 3, it turns out God is one of those religious Mexicans who doesn't drink or smoke weed, so all the Mexicans in heaven party in the basement while God reads the Bible and thumbs a rosary. God threatens to kick all the Mexicans out of heaven if they don't stop con las pendejadas, so the Mexicans drink more discreetly. They smoke outside where God won't smell the weed. God pretends the Mexicans are reformed. Hallelujah. This cycle repeats once a month. Amen. 4, Jesus has a tattoo of La Virgen de Guadalupe covering his back. It turns out he's your cousin Jesus from the block. It turns out he gets reincarnated every day and no one on earth cares all that much. 5, all the Mexican women refuse to cook or clean or raise the kids or pay bills or make the bed or drive you to work or do anything except watch their novelas. So heaven is gross. The rats are fat as roosters and the men die of starvation. 6, there are white people in heaven too. They build condos across the street and ask the Mexicans to speak English. I'm just kidding. There are no white people in heaven. 7, tamales, tacos, tostadas, tortas, pozole, sopes, huaraches, menudo, horchata, jamaica, limonada, agua. 8, St. Peter lets Mexicans into heaven, but only to work in the kitchens. A Mexican dishwasher polishes the crystal, smells the meals, and hears the music. They dream of another heaven, one they might be allowed in if only they work hard enough. Cool. So thank you everyone so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So we've got some great questions here. First up, that first poem was fire. I identified with it so much. Just wondering what your process is. How do you go about connecting your thoughts to paper?
So first, thank you for that comment. I'm glad that the first poem resonated with you. You know, I was trying to, sometimes you have an idea or a feeling and you have to figure out how to frame it and what the right shape for that poem is, right? So I wanted to write a poem that was about, you know, I kind of traced that poem back to when I was a student in college. I studied abroad in Brazil. And my whole life, I never had any questions as to my identity. Like I knew I was Mexican, and I knew that being a Mexican in Calumet City, Illinois, meant that I was a person of color. That was where my allegiances were. And then I visited Brazil, and I was like, my whole life I was like, I'm Latino. I'm like, like I know, like I'm down, right? And then I was in Brazil, and they were like, yo, everyone is Latino. Like, what are you talking about? Like you are, like breaking news, like you are white, like these other white Latinos in Brazil who are telling us who we are, right? And so that experience was very shocking to me, which, some of you listening might be laughing at that or whatever. But for me, I just didn't expect that. And now looking back, I'm like, I can't believe I didn't expect that. So anyway, I knew I wanted to write a poem about how identity shifts, and like thinking about my parents and how, they might have been one thing in Mexico and then they moved to the United States and their identity shifted even though they were the same person, right? And I didn't really figure out that poem until I heard Idris's poem, which is thinking about, Blackness, and he uses the term brown a lot. And so he was thinking about, the various contradictions there. And so listening to that poem made me think, I didn't have to write a poem that just gave the answers. I could give a poem that kind of brought out the contradictions and the movements depending on the place, right? So I could kind of put pressure on those identities by changing the context. And so that's kind of how that poem came to be.
Thank you. Is there particular Latin American poetry that you draw inspiration from?
Is there particular Latin American poetry? I have to be honest and say that I haven't read a ton of Latin American poetry. I've been very lucky in the last few years to begin building relationships with poets in Mexico specifically, and specifically in Ciudad de Mexico. I got a chance to go as part of like an exchange program between artists in Chicago or from Chicago and artists in Mexico City. And so I'm starting to kind of build those relationships and read more Latin American poetry that way. But, I didn't really have access to it. Also, my ability to read Spanish is not, like I can read it, but it's not, I wasn't educated in Spanish, so I don't have a super strong grasp of Spanish that way. But I will say that there were tons of Latinx poets. So, Latino American poets that influenced me. And a few right off the top of my head that I could think of are Willie Perdomo, who's a Puerto Rican poet from East Harlem, Araceli Esquilmar, who's one of my favorite poets of all time, and then Sandra Cisneros, who, especially as a fellow poet from Chicago, was a huge inspiration to me throughout my young adulthood.
Great, thank you. What advice would you give to high school kids who are thinking of writing their own poetry?
My advice is to go for it. I really love poetry, and I think it can be a useful exercise in strengthening one's imagination, both for the world and oneself. I think you should totally go for it. If you're wondering, like, perhaps where to start, I would say find the poets that you love and read their work, and then try to figure out like who they read. Like one of the cool things for me, like when I found, for example, Sandra Cisneros and I read her work, I could see that she thanked Gwendolyn Brooks in her writing, right? And so then I could trace that lineage back to Gwendolyn Brooks, and I could see who were contemporaries of Miss Brooks, and kind of start to build for myself a type of curriculum for my own learning.
That's a great answer. So one of our participants wants to know where you got your shirt.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't remember off the top of my head. Maybe it was Hija de tu Madre is where I got this shirt. I can't remember though.
Fair enough. So this is a question from me. In one of the poems that you read, you have the sentence, "Perspective is a magic trick." And that really struck with me. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little about how your perspective has developed since the point at which you started sharing your poetry in public, and maybe also about the ways in which the perspectives that you sense coming from your audiences have changed over time, how they vary depending upon where you are and who you're talking to, and how all of that comes together to form different magic tricks over time and across space.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is, I'm kind of beginning with the last question first, but going to different places has taught me to read my own poems in different ways. So, for example, today I read the poem "Getting Ready to Say I Love You to My Dad," which when I was initially planning my events for my book, I didn't think about reading that poem out loud at very many places, just because to me that poem feels a little quieter than some of the other poems I've written. And so I didn't know how it would translate to being spoken in front of audiences. And yet, without fail, that one is one of the poems that resonates the most with people. And so that's something that I couldn't have predicted, just kind of, sitting in my own writing space and thinking about how my poems fit together. I think there's moments where I can kind of predict it. Like when I wrote Mexican American Disambiguation, the first poem that I read today, like I kind of knew right away that was kind of like an anthem type poem. Like I knew that was a banger. So sometimes I'm right about my sense of it, but other times I'm wrong. And sometimes there are things that I think are funny that audiences think are sad, or there's things that they find, vice versa, that they find funny that I think are sad or angry. And so reading it like also shows me new ways to read my poems, right? The texts are not solid for me either. There's many ways for me to read them too. And then in terms of like how my perspective has changed, I think when I was a younger poet, I was very concerned with writing poems where like the speaker was kind of the center of the poem and then everything kind of filtered through that, if that makes sense. And so even the poems, like, for example, my early attempts to write poems about my parents, they were really poems about me. You know what I mean? Like one of the biggest educational moments for me in my writing process was, I wrote a poem that I wanted it to be a poem from my mom, but in the poem, my mom spends, the entire poem in the kitchen cooking. And I had a mentor, Tony Asante Lightfoot, who pulled me aside and was like, there's a lot of really good imagery in this poem, but maybe you should consider that your mom lives a full life and is not just living a life to like cook and take care of you, right? And again, this is maybe like a simple thing, but for me, I was like, you're totally right. Like that is how I'm writing her in this way. And so I need to kind of like, I had to learn how to shift my way of seeing, beyond myself, if that makes sense. And so that, I think that's one of the biggest shifts in the perspectives of my poems.
Thank you. Thank you. This was incredible. Could you speak to your view on the role of the poet in times of unrest? Is that something you talk about with poet friends? Your words are so powerful.
Thank you for that. Honestly, what I talk about with my poet friends usually is basketball. Like we're in a group chat together where we're like cracking jokes about Damian Lillard and wondering who's going to make the playoffs. So I'm grateful for that space. In terms of like, what is the role of the poet during times of unrest? I think one, I wonder what your definition of unrest is, because I kind of feel like in some ways we're always in moments of unrest. So I think the role of the poet is to imagine. And I wonder like, and to kind of be, how can I put it? So to imagine other possibilities, right? Like one of the most frustrating things to me was like, I would sit in conversations with people and we'd be discussing policy. And whenever I mentioned like, that I support Medicare for all, they'd be like, but that's just not, that's just not practical, right? It would cost too much. And I think that our framing is bad, right? It doesn't make sense to me, because what's not practical is people that, end up with huge costs because they get sick. And that's not something that you can control. And so I think the role of the poet is to help imagine other possibilities, right? To kind of dream other ways of being, and to remind people that we don't have to settle for the status quo, right? Like before the carceral state, there were other ways of being, and not that those ways were perfect, but we can continue to push for something different. And then the other thing is that for me, like, especially growing up in Chicago, there was always poetry at the various protests. There was always somebody performing or sharing a piece. And it's because, I guess I don't know exactly why that is, because I don't know if that's like specifically a Chicago thing, or if it's because poetry helps remind us of what the stakes are, or can remind us, right? Not all poems do, but I think poetry can remind us of what the stakes are and what we have to gain by continuing to fight for one another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question here. As someone who is also a white Chicano, I love the way you discuss the relativity of race. Can you say a bit about how you started writing poetry, and were you supported in school or by your family in this endeavor?
That's a good question. So first I want to say that, you know, one, I don't identify as a white Chicano. I think this question is really interesting for a number of reasons, but I've been reading a book called Manifest Destinies, which makes the argument that Mexicans in the United States and Latinx people, Latinos more broadly, have never been white. And there's been like special laws created, and you can trace it back to the history of Mexican Americans or Chicanos or whatever, Latinos in this country, to see that that's never been true. So I think race is much more complicated than it's often made to look. And then the second part of that question, I have already forgotten because I don't know, but could you repeat it? Yes. I could try and pull it up.
Can you say a bit about how you started writing poetry, and were you supported in school? Were you supported in school or by your family in this endeavor?
Yeah, so I started writing poetry in high school because I was really into hip hop, and I also learned very quickly that I was a, you know, mediocre to very terrible rapper, and so you know, that wasn't going to work out for me. But we had a poetry slam program at our high school, and so you know, I went one day to listen to them read their poems, and I had no expectation of liking poetry. I had, you know, we had studied some poems in school, but no one ever asked us to kind of make our own poems. And I was blown away by the performances, and immediately I knew that that was something that I wanted to do too. So seeing young people read poems was really powerful to me. It also like those were also the only moments where the adults listened to us as young people. Like, I don't know how much schooling has changed in the, you know, 10 years that I've been out of high school, but we were always told that our role was just to kind of learn from teachers. And we, you know, very rarely did they ask us to bring our expertise to the room. So poetry was inspiring for me because it was a chance, you know, I was a smartass. And so it was a chance to kind of, you know, get to school my teachers in a way, right? And get to talk about the things that I knew and felt. So that was how I got into it. My parents were not super understanding at first, but I will say, I think I got a lot more leeway in terms of the choices I got to make because I'm a man. And so my parents, even though they were confused and didn't fully understand and wanted me to be a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, they also didn't actively try to sabotage me. You know what I mean? Like, they still let me go to my competitions. They didn't, you know, force me to stay home or anything like that. So now they're very supportive, in part because, like, you know, they can show their coworkers, or, you know, back in the day, they could show their coworkers like articles in the Chicago Tribune where they talk about me or whatever. So now they're like, you know, mijo, you make me so proud. So it's cool that they've gotten more supportive for sure.
Great. Well, that's a great segue to the next question. A lot of your poems are about your family. And I feel that. I'm an immigrant and the son of immigrants growing up in this country, and there's so much culture clash between me and my parents and the outside world. I guess my question is, why do you write so much about your family?
That's a good question. This kind of connects to my answer about, like, what is the role of the poet during times of unrest? And I think I write a lot about my parents, in part because our relationships are imperfect, and I'm trying to, you know, help write through bridges to better relationships with them. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to figure out why exactly it is that we kind of disconnect from time to time and can't quite manage to get on the same page, even though we both, like, really want to. And so for me, I think I take a lot of inspiration in not just like writing poems that complain about that relationship, but that try to like strive towards some sort of healing has been like a generative space for me. And then the last thing I'll say is I also think that like, a lot of times when we're talking about migration, we don't talk about like the mental health aspect and like how there's wounds. Like one of the things that I think about a lot, right, is my parents were undocumented, and for years we would go to an immigration lawyer on Saturdays in Chicago, and my parents didn't tell us why we were going to like this basement office every Saturday for like 4 hours for years until, we were like 10 or 12 years old or whatever. And so that's like an example of a silence that existed between us. And that's just like one example of many. And so I think I try to write to kind of bridge those spaces of silence.
So the next question is, I love hip hop. Who are your favorite hip hop lyricists today?
That's a great question. My favorite hip hop lyricists, there's so many. My favorite all time is probably Andre 3000. My favorites right now are probably like a rapper named Saba out of Chicago I really like. And then a rapper named No Name, who's probably best known now for her book club. But those are kind of the three that come to mind. Also in Long Beach, there's a rapper named Vince Staples that I really love. I think he's really surprising and witty in his rhymes. So those are some of the first people that come to mind for me.
Great, thank you. Have you read The Labyrinth of Solitude? And if yes, how did that work react within you?
I have not read The Labyrinth of Solitude. So
that's a short answer then.
yeah. So I'll write that one down to look it up.
Yeah, I'm whizzing through here. So several people have said how much they enjoyed your new short story, and in various different versions of these questions, they're interested to know where it's going, where your plans are for it, how this is evolving, which kind of takes us back to your process, right?
Yeah. These are great questions, and I don't know that I have answers to them. Like I said, I haven't written a ton of short stories, so I'm kind of discovering what the process looks like for myself as I go. I think, it's very hard for me. Like I think writing poems is hard, but writing short stories is so hard. I've only written like 3,000 words, and I struggled. It took me so long to write those 3,000 words. And people who are like professional novelists, I see them write and they're like, I typed 50,000 words today, and it blows my mind. So I think I kind of just have to like learn what my process is. I have an idea for, like I was saying, right? Like I wanted to tell a story of migration in reverse, in part inspired by a Toni Morrison novel that I can't recall off the top of my head, but she wrote in her preface that so often stories of like Black migration are south to north. And so she started one of her novels with the character going north to south. And so I had this similar idea because I think the same is true for Mexicans, right? So often our stories of migration are south to north. And so I wanted to write a story of migration where the character goes from north to south.
You've talked in passing about performance, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, when you're writing your poetry, is it already turning into a performance in your head, or at what point does it begin to become either a potential performance or an actual performance?
I don't think it becomes a performance until I'm with the audience reading the poem. I do think that performance is a big part of my revision process. Like in part, I wanted to read that short story so that I could get a sense of like, I mean, and it's much more helpful if we're in the same room, right? And I can see in real time, like if the jokes land or they don't land, or, you know, if someone in the front row starts to nod off or whatever, all of that is useful information to me. And so, especially because like as a writer, I don't have the professional degree, right? I don't have an MFA. And so I haven't spent a ton of time in traditional workshop spaces. The open mic and the reading is where I get my feedback. It's where I learn, you know, like we were talking about earlier, it's where I learn the different possibilities that exist in my poem. So then when I revise them, I can see, you know, if I want to make it funnier, right? Like maybe someone laughed at something and I'm like, oh, I can like riff off of that joke and expand it. But the other thing that I'm looking for is, to me, the biggest question when I'm writing is like, does this piece of art have soul? And it's like, I can kind of tell when I'm writing, but it's not really until I share it with someone that I can get a sense of, you know, if it's kind of got a life beyond me, if that makes sense, right? Like if it has soul, then I can figure out the technical aspects and make it work. But if the soul is not there, then you know, then it's maybe time to scrap it and work on the next piece.
So let's talk just for a few moments about the whole process of adapting to engaging and performing via Zoom and webinar and so on. I assume this is not the first time that you've done this over the last few months. Could you talk a little bit about your experience of adapting to this? I mean, when we, as you pointed out a minute ago, usually you can sort of tell from the audience how things are going. And, you know, I was really impressed by the way in which you were sort of maintaining energy and spontaneity, even though there isn't that quote unquote normal connection. So how are you adapting to this new virtual form of engagement?
That's a great question. I don't know that I am. I really miss being in front of people. And I find Zoom, like I'm grateful for these opportunities, but I find it so much more exhausting, in part because when you're in person with a group of people, there's like a certain amount of energy that the audience can give back. But in this setting, I find that I have to give all of the energy constantly. And so at the end of these, I feel much more drained and tired than I usually do. I mean, I have learned how to do them a little better. And I think, so I used to host a podcast, and I think that was really useful training for this, in part because you know, like I'm also not a trained podcast host. The way I learned how to do podcasts was like, you know, I mentioned basketball earlier. And so I listened to a lot of sports. And so I tried to, you know, take tricks from my favorite sports announcers and radio hosts and use those kind of like moves when I was hosting podcasts, right? And so the same thing, learning to kind of joke around, even though I can't hear you, I can imagine you there kind of receiving me. So I think that's what's helped me, but I'm not used to it. It's still very hard.
Mm-hmm. I've had that same experience myself about realizing that I'm not getting the energy back in from the audience. It's very challenging. Okay,
Yes.
another question here. I was an avid reader of your newsletter, Mexican Heaven. Do you have any plans to restart or revisit this? And again, P.S. I love the short story you shared. I really hope to read it someday once it's complete.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. I do have plans to restart that newsletter. The newsletters are still up if people want to go look through the archive. It's called Mexican Heaven. You know, I stopped writing because I'm thinking through a longer essay and I didn't have the knowledge or I didn't have the range to write it. And so specifically the essay that's been on my mind has been about Latinidad and whether, you know, Latinidad is a useful way to claim identity and solidarity with one another. And so I've been reading a lot about, you know, the history of that term, and I've been trying to think through whether or not it's useful. And so that newsletter will return when I'm kind of able to write that essay. So thank you for subscribing, and yes, it'll come back. I just have to, you know, I'm still learning too, and so I'm trying to figure out how to write what I need to write.
So one of our participants has an extra ticket to the KU basketball games and is saying that, you know, once it's safe to travel and so on, if ever you want to go to a basketball game at KU, you'd be very welcome. So there you go.
Listen, I'm delighted by that offer, and I will take you up on that. I've never been to a college basketball game.
Really?
Yeah, and I've, you know, in part, so I went to Harvard for college, and we actually had a good team when I was there. Like Jeremy Lin is the same year as me, so our team was not terrible. But I just, you know, I was like, I'm not going to watch Harvard basketball, so I missed out, so I would love to go watch a KU basketball team for sure.
Yeah, I will confess that until I came here a year ago, I had never been to a basketball game, period. And I was taken along by a new friend, and it was a life-changing experience. Both the game itself and the experience of what was going on around me, it was mind-blowing.
Yeah, I feel like I can't say no to that. I want to experience that.
Yeah, it's something else. So a very different kind of question. Regarding your comment about the MFA, is getting one in your future plans at all?
That's a good question. I don't know. I've thought about it, and maybe I'll apply to a few schools this year, just because with all of the uncertainty of coronavirus, I just think it might make sense to keep a bunch of options open for the time being, because I have no idea, you know, what the world will look like in 4 months or a year or two. So maybe. And I think it would be useful. Like I like school. I feel better prepared to go back to school and like really dig in and learn. And I'd love the time to just kind of focus on that. So maybe I think right now I'm in a good place of like I've been able to kind of do what I need to do without the MFA degree, and so as long as I don't have to, you know, I know for sure that I do not want to pay for an MFA. So as long as I can go to a program for free, then I will, you know, I'm definitely considering it, especially now.
That sounds very reasonable to me. Another question, Jose, I have so enjoyed your presentation of your poetry. Hearing your background reminds me of my father, who traveled from north to south, living his last 25 years in Mexico with great affection. Where do you see yourself going from here? It's a very multi-potential question.
Yeah, that really is. That also feels like the type of question that is easier to ask in person, you know, like
yeah,
hearing it now, like, I don't know if that means like, where do I see myself geographically?
right, or 10 years from now, or
yeah.
Well, take it whichever direction you want to.
You know, geographically, I always imagine myself in Chicago. Realistically, you know, I don't know where I'll be geographically, but in terms of like what I'm planning on doing next, there's a collaborative book of poems and photographs that I'm working on with a friend out in Arizona. So I need to get back to writing those drafts. You know, I'm continuing, you know, hopefully to think through these ideas of Latinidad and posting essays about it on my newsletter. And I'm thinking about doing like kind of these pop-up classes around things that really interest me in poetry and in lyrics. So those are some of the ideas. And then I have an idea for a novel. So if this short story goes well, then, you know, maybe I'll start working on this novel too.
That sounds incredibly exciting. So as a closing question, can I ask you, of all the many questions that you're asked, do you have a favorite one? And can you share it with us and then answer it?
Yeah, I like that question. I don't know that I have a favorite question. Yeah, I don't know. You know, in part, it's been a while since I've gotten to travel. And so I don't know what my favorite question is. I really enjoy the questions about hip hop and sports and whatever. Just because, you know, for me, I think part of what I love about writing is one of the things that's important to me is I'm writing poems not into a void, right? Like I'm writing poems and I'm writing everything to connect with people. Like I want the exchange, right? And so I like talking about things that are outside of writing because it reminds me that, how can I put it, that we're, you know, poems are dope, but I don't want to just ground myself in theory. I want to remain living in and working with and towards the people and communities that I care and love. So that I care about and love. So I like those questions because they remind me to be grounded in the real world and kind of leave my books to the side from time to time.
Right.
So yeah, I think that those are my favorite questions, but honestly, I really, you know, you could probably tell by now, like I like talking, so I'll take all questions.
No, but that's a great answer. Well, I wish we could have been all in the same room, but this has been an amazing experience, and I can't wait at some point in the future to be in the same room, listening to you reading and feeling your energy. But meanwhile, all the very best wishes, and thank you so much for sharing your work and your passion with us this evening. It's been quite extraordinary.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you to everyone tuning in. Stay safe, everyone, and I'm, you know, likewise looking forward to getting to visit Kansas in real time.
And the basketball.
Oh, absolutely! Please send me the name of whoever
Yeah.
sent that in.
I will. Okay, well, thank you so much and good night. And thank you everybody for coming. We'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.